Hey everyone, this is Ira Nicodemus with Holistic Utility Solutions, and today we're making a video about the importance of properly sizing solar systems, especially in commercial applications. Let's get started. If you're in a commercial building, whether that's a school, a city, a business, most likely you're going to have a rate structure that's different than what you have at your home. Most folks at home are going to have just a pure consumption based rate, but in the commercial sector, you have a combination of demand and consumption. It's really important that we understand these and that we account for them properly when we're looking at what our savings is going to be from a solar system. If we just take your average rate, what we call the blended rate, which is your total cost and your total consumption, most likely that's not going to be the same as what you're actually going to see for savings when you actually implement your solar system. So we're going to cover some basics and then how you address this and account for it so that you make sure you actually get the right size system for your business. So I'm going to be referencing an article that I wrote here on our website on the importance of properly sizing solar systems in Texas. I focused on Texas because we do not have net metering, but a lot of these concepts are going to apply regardless of what state you're in, especially if you're also someone who does not have net metering in the state. So let's start with a review of consumption and demand. So demand is typically measured in watts or kilowatts, which is 1,000 watts, and over time those become kilowatt hours, which is consumption. So when we look at how you're being billed typically on both of those. So when the utility looks at a commercial building, if you're on a tariff or a rate structure that has a demand component, then they're going to be looking at the highest amount that you used at any given time. Oftentimes this is down to a 15-minute or a 1-hour increment. Just depends on the utility and what they're measuring and how they bill. But you can think of this in a way kind of like the speed limit and when you're driving a car. If we say that we're going to drive 1 hour and we cover 60 miles, then we could say that we drove an average of 60 miles per hour. And our consumption, our total consumption is that 60 miles, right? But the reality is that during that time, we're going to vary our speed. And if at some point we were going 100 miles an hour and we get pulled over by a police officer, he's not concerned about the fact that we were covering an average of 60 miles in an hour. He's worried about that point in time where we were going 100 miles an hour, and that's why you're going to get a ticket, right? So it's kind of the same thing with demand charges in the utility. They're looking for the highest amount that you're going to use at a given time. So this is important when it comes to solar because even if we're producing a lot of consumption, if we're not also offsetting that demand, that can be an issue. And even if we know that at times we're going to offset the demand, let's say that demand is set on a typically in the afternoon and solar should be producing, we still want to be careful because if the solar system is down or if we have a cloudy day or whatever the situation is, we're not getting that maximum output. At the same time, we can set that demand and it can impact you for the month or in some cases even for a full year, even for just that short period, 15 minutes or an hour that you are using that higher demand. When we look at demand charges, the other piece we'll cover here briefly is coincident peak versus non-coincident peak. Understand your tariff. In many situations, there's going to be a combination of demand charges. Some will be based on non-coincident peak times, which is basically when you set your peak, and then coincident peak, which is when the grid is setting its peak, how much are you using during those times. So different tariffs will structure this differently. Here in North Texas, we are Encore. So I have an example here of their tariff and it shows how some of these rate structures are set up that way. So make sure you understand this when you go to plug into your system and calculate your savings and how much demand you're going to save. So now that we understand demand, let's talk about consumption because it's still important that we understand when consumption is being used. And to cover this, I'm going to give an example that's maybe an extreme example, but let's look at if you had a meter. Typically solar is going to be done at the meter level. So think about what this meter serves and think about if you had a meter that was only nighttime lighting. So it's a very simple load. When the lights come on at night, you see a very consistent spike up. That's what we're seeing here. They go off during the day and then it spikes up. So this is an extreme example, but I want to drive home this concept of what can happen. So if we have a solar system, which is obviously only producing power during the day, we're assuming we don't have any storage here, no batteries or anything, it's never going to be offsetting the load that's here. So the utility will typically put in a meter that's bidirectional. So they can see the difference of you pulling that power at night versus you exporting power back because the meter's not using it, the lights don't need it. So whatever that solar system's producing is being pushed back, and they treat those as two different items. This is what we call not having the net metering. If you had net metering, essentially what they're doing is they would use that production during the day to offset the usage at night over the course of maybe of the billing period, like the month. But when you don't have net metering, these are treated differently. So for most utilities here in Texas and other areas, this is very important to understand. And here's why. Normally, you're not going to be getting as much value for what you're sending back to the grid as you are what you're paying. So think of it as kind of a wholesale retail situation. They're buying power at some wholesale rate, and then they're selling it to you at a retail rate. So what you're paying for this power, even here at night for what you're running these lights, is going to be less than what they're going to buy this for if they pay you anything at all. A lot of this is going to come down, if you're in a deregulated market, it's going to come down to what plan is your retail electric provider have you on. So we want to be real careful that we don't just assume that the value of the solar now, one, we want to make sure that we're not accounting for any demand savings because we know that we're really not going to be generating anything during the same time. And then two, we want to make sure that we understand what that consumption is because it may be different than what we're actually paying. We can't just go based on the amount that's on the bill. So now that we looked at an example, that extreme example of the meter that had the nighttime lighting on it, let's look at one that is kind of the other extreme of a meter that only has daytime load on it. So maybe this is something like a pump that kicks on in the morning, runs all day, and then comes off at night. So when we look at this now, we have the solar production coming up in the morning, and then throughout the day when it's producing, the first thing it's going to do is feed that load. So it's going to feed its power into that first, and then if there was anything in addition, that will get exported back. But in this case, if we size this properly, we really aren't having that issue. Now, we may have, depending on when this load comes on, we may have periods in the morning or in the evening where we are exporting, but during the day, most of that's going to be used by that motor, by the load. So the value of this during the day now becomes whatever we're not having to pay to the utility, that retail rate. So let's say you're paying 6 cents a kilowatt hour. This power here is worth the 6 cents a kilowatt hour, but maybe what you're sending back in the morning may only be worth 1 or 2 cents because of that wholesale retail difference. So we need to understand when we're producing power, when the meter is using power, and account for that properly when we look at the rate tariff and both our retail consumption side and our demand side. So when we put all this together, what does it really mean? We have to first break down exactly what that rate structure is, what those policies are, what your demand charges are, when they're in effect, what your consumption charges are they different throughout the day? Do you have different time of use rates? All these different factors. What do you get paid for your net exports back? And then what are your offsets when you're actually using the power yourself? Calculate this both on the demand and the consumption side. A lot of times what we see, and we see this in residential as well, is that someone will just come along and say, hey, we size the system to be 100% offset. So what that means is that the consumption for that meter through the year is going to be equal to the production of the solar system through the year. And people might look at that and kind of assume, oh, that means that I'm not going to have a utility bill. The reality is that not only can you have a utility bill, you may not get nearly as much savings as you would think if you just multiply that consumption by your commodity rate or your blended rate. So you really need to do this analysis properly. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want to have a system that ever exports to the grid. So for example, we were recently looking at a structure where the wholesale rate, the avoided cost rate that the utility was paying was about 5.5 cents. What the customer was paying on the commodity side was about 8 cents. Now, the demand charge was separate, so we had to calculate that piece. But when we just look at the consumption Anytime that we are self-producing, we are getting basically that savings of 8 cents, and when we're sending it back to the grid, we're getting about 5 cents. So what we did was we kind of looked at that system and we said, well, if we only have, let's say, a 20% offset, which would have very little time that we were ever going to be exporting to the grid, yeah, we're not selling grid stuff power back at 5 cents, but at the same time, we were only offsetting maybe 20% at that 8 cents. So we kind of have to do this. We started to play with that and say, well, what happens if we go to 40% or to 60%? And what happens is, as we did more of that, we do start to export more power back to the grid at that 5 cents. However, we're also offsetting more of that power that we don't have to buy at the 8 cents. So when you look at this versus your actual cost of producing that power, so what does the system cost? What are the incentives? And we bake all that into the equation, we start to get this kind of balance of there's a sweet spot there where we can maximize the overall savings from the system, the overall net present value, by really kind of looking at that properly. If we go too far to one side, we'll end up having a lot of excess production that we're not really getting anything for. But if we go too little, we may be leaving money on the table. So it's an interesting concept to think about. I know this is a little bit technical, but hopefully it helps you understand the importance of doing this for your business, but in some cases even for your home, although you won't have demand charges on most residential systems. If you're interested in having us look at your meters and your systems to do a proper sizing analysis and savings analysis, reach out. This is one of the services that we offer. We'd love to work with you and help you either as an owner's rep or even do your project for you, especially if you're here in the Texas area. So appreciate you watching the video today and look forward to talking to you soon.